My name is Dr. Grace Telesco.
My name is Dr. Grace Telesco.
My name is Dr. Grace Telesco. I'm joined by Dr. Teresa Lily White,
Dr. Lenore Walker, Mr. Ed Denzel.
Investigation with Dr. T is something that actually was the brainchild of our dean, Dr. Durham. And now, coming up this next season, we're going to be doing it almost weekly, a weekly show on a Thursday night. So lots of really cool guests. It's not just police topics, it's not just corrections topics, but it's topics that are affecting us in kind of all areas. But one of the things that we hope to get across is raising awareness, educating about some of these really important topics like human trafficking, topics like disasters. We did a show, Confessions of a Serial Killer. So for this upcoming season, we've got a couple of really cool things. We're going to have a day in the life of a DEA agent. Another really cool one, which is really close to my heart, is going to be on September 11th. Because not only do we want to talk about 9/11 and the work of the NYPD, but I also want to really look at the mental health outcomes. We also have the human trafficking panel. We are going to bring back our Brevard Sheriff, Sheriff Wayne Ivey. It's always a pleasure to have him on. We're going to have Unfound again, Ed Denzel. He'll be coming back a few times, and that's going to be really exciting and interesting too.
So welcome everybody. Again, Dr. Grace Telesco from the Abraham Fischler College of Education and School of Criminal Justice. And we're live streaming from our YouTube channel. And I am very excited about our guest tonight. Very excited. She is a star. She's a rising star. She's amazing. She's going to tell you a little bit about who she is, but it's sort of a two-edged program tonight. And I say that because in one respect, we're going to be talking about red flag laws and risk protection order as it relates to, ultimately we're going to be, the overall topic is, shootings, active shooter, school shootings, for example. And our guest is going to be talking about some of the profile of the shooters and how the risk protection order and red flag laws help either reduce these incidents or not. What role do they play? And she'll talk a little bit about the literature, and she's going to talk about her research specifically. Her name is Dr. Brooke Elvington. She is a practicing attorney. She's a criminal defense attorney. I know that if I get locked up, I'm definitely calling her for sure. Dr. Elvington was my student. I was the chair of her committee. I was the chair of your committee, right?
Yes, you were.
Yeah, I thought so. I was like, was I? Yeah, I like to take the credit for the good ones. No, but anyway, she was an amazing PhD student in our program, and so she has a JD and now a PhD in criminal justice. And this study she's going to talk about was the sum and substance of her dissertation. And she is now full-time faculty with us in the School of Criminal Justice. And how lucky we are and privileged we are to have not only someone of her caliber, but also an attorney. It's always good to have an attorney on the staff. You know what I mean? Like, just, you never know. We're constantly asking her little consult questions here and there. And she's amazing in that way. And I know that you drove all the way because you had class today and you drove all the way home so that you could get to the show tonight. And I really, really appreciate it. I know that, you must be, today was a long day. And I want you to know that it's not lost on me how much of an effort you made to still be a guest on the show tonight. So Dr. Elvington, thank you. Tell us a little bit about you, because I think that the first thing that a lot of our students are going to want to know, and a lot of our viewers are going to want to know, is, the life of a criminal defense attorney, and and how exciting that is, to defend those who need defending, and it's our Sixth Amendment right. So, and it's the nature of our system, which is a beautiful system. Needs a little bit of work, but it's still a beautiful system nevertheless. So Dr. Elvington, please, with no further ado, tell us a little bit about you in terms of your experience, your expertise, and then we could dive a little bit into, well, I'll put my 2 cents in and steer the conversation to active shooter.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for the incredibly warm welcome. Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm really, really happy to be here and to chat with all of you. So I have been a criminal defense lawyer now for 22 years. The entire time that I've been practicing law has been focused on criminal defense. So this is kind of my baby. I teach criminal law now at Nova, and I always tell the students, if I'm being biased, it is absolutely my favorite thing to teach, because it's not just my wheelhouse, but honestly, it's what I'm passionate about, right? I genuinely enjoy what I do. And I will tell you, I taught criminal law today. I had students on ground, and it was kind of funny because as I talk about cases, to kind of make things real for them, to take it out of a textbook and to put it into pragmatic terms, I'm talking about real criminal cases, and you can see the cringe on people's faces, realizing that some of these cases are ugly, right? I mean, we're dealing sometimes with not the best set of factual parameters. And as a defense attorney in particular, the question is often asked how we do what we do, right? I mean, there's this saying that judges often say, and that is, family law clients, divorce cases, they're often good people, but on their absolute worst behavior with their lawyers. And criminal defendants are sometimes bad people, but on their best behavior. We're dealing with a different type of dynamic. But what it's like, we're doing a job, and we're doing a really important job. And that is, we're put in a position to defend not just an individual, but to defend the entire system, right? We're sort of the check in the system. We're there to stand in the way from the government encroaching upon our liberties and our rights. We're there to make sure that police are doing their job the way that they should, that prosecutors are doing the job that they should, that judges are following the law. That really is our job. Our job is not a fact finder. Our job is not to judge a client and what they may or may not have done. Our job is not even to determine whether they're innocent. That's not our job. Our job is simply to stand in the way of the government, make sure they do their job. So that's how I do what I do, in kind of a nutshell. But from a purely, I suppose, selfish perspective, these cases are fascinating. Every single case comes with a story. I mean, it could be something as small as a misdemeanor offense. I don't handle many misdemeanors anymore. My practice ranged anywhere from your small misdemeanor offenses all the way up to first-degree murder and terrorism. But most of these cases come with stories. You're dealing with human actors here, with real events that happen not just to defendants, but to victims and sometimes entire communities. So it's always interesting.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if you're probably not right now watching the YouTube chat blow up. But I will tell you that you have a lot of fans. We have Alexis Cuomo, who is one of my students who met you at the preliminary hearing that we're doing. We're doing the this mock trial throughout our intro to CJ class.
Yes.
And you were really generous, so generous in saying yes to being the judge, to playing our judge for the preliminary hearings, which are suppression hearings. And so she's the lead defense attorney for the mock trial. She's an undergrad. I think Alexis is interested in becoming an attorney. And so she gave you a little heart. She's like, we love Dr. Elvington. So
you.
So that's really nice, to hear that, right? And to know that. And also Dr. Elvington is going to be generously giving of her time again to be the judge for our mock trial. And what we do in Intro to CJ, what I do anyway, when I teach the class, is from the very beginning, there's this homicide that happens, homicide of an adjunct an adjunct who is having an affair with another staff member's wife in the School of Criminal Justice. It's very saucy. Anyway, he's murdered, and the students have to do like compile all of the evidence and then put on the trial. And so we have half of the class are defense attorneys and the other half are the prosecution. And so Dr. Elvington is going to be our judge. We're going to do it in the law school. We're going to do it in courtroom 1. It's always a lot of fun. Anyway, so thank you for that also, Dr. Elvington. So switch gears a little bit. You know, you were interested. I guess what I'd like to know is, here you are, successful criminal defense attorney. And I mean successful. You are. There's no doubt that you are successful. And you've been doing it for like decades, right? So what made you decide that you wanted to get a PhD in criminal justice?
Well, because what I recognized is the practice of law is very, very limited, right? Meaning we don't talk about theory. We don't talk about what works, what doesn't work, right? We recognize as stakeholders in the field, right? We recognize where things go wrong. We recognize, for instance, that minimum mandatory sentences that are imposed by legislatures are terrible, right? And put more academic, they have no efficacy whatsoever. In other words, they're not reducing crime and they're creating mass incarceration problems. That's just one example. You know, we see so many things that happen in the practice of law, but our hands are tied. We're not there to evaluate policy or to develop policy and to implement theory. That's not what we do as lawyers. It's not what we're supposed to do as lawyers. So the idea of going into the PhD was really to further develop my own knowledge base and my ability to contribute to the field in areas that I thought could use a little bit more of the grounded theory to hopefully influence future policy. So that was why I did it. You go through years of living this life, and you see, probably very much like you saw as a law enforcement officer, right? You see it in practice, but you can't do much about it when you're just a practitioner. So that's why I did it.
Yeah. And then you had all these schools to choose from, all these PhD programs to select from, and you land on NSU. Why?
For a number of reasons.
Shameless plug.
Shameless plug, right? Well, I know Nova, right? So when I enrolled in Nova, I was actually teaching at Husson University in Maine. But I am a Floridian. My practice is in Florida. I've been in Florida since I was 16 years old. So I know Nova. I know its caliber as an institution. I did research on the PhD program specifically in CJ. I looked at the curriculum. I wanted to make sure that I would have academic freedom to do what I needed. I also needed flexibility, so I needed an online program. And I looked at faculty. I was, in fact, I don't think I ever told you this. I specifically looked at your profile, and I loved the fact that this was balanced, meaning you weren't just academic, you had practical experience. And truthfully, I think that's really where students benefit, is when a professor joins those two things and isn't just behind a book, but can explain in practical terms how this stuff works. So those are really the reasons why I selected Nova.
Excellent. And tell me more about my eyes. Anybody, you're too young to know what that means. That's a Bugs Bunny reference. But anyway, so now you get to the program, you do all your coursework, and now it's time to select a topic. So you select the topic for your dissertation, which dissertation is going to be either qualitative or quantitative research in the field of criminal justice. And, kind of like addressing that gap. There's a gap perhaps in the literature, something that's not been studied necessarily. So how did you go about selecting your topic?
So the topic itself, I've always been interested in serial homicide, for instance. Homicide cases were always my favorite to deal with, mostly, like I said, because of the human story that goes behind them. But serial and mass homicide are totally different animals, right? And I don't mean to say this to be minimizing, because obviously we still have a loss of life, but most murder cases, really, there's not a lot of science to it, right? There's a lot of impulsivity. It's sort of a perfect storm that comes together for the individual actors that commit the acts of murder. But serial and mass murder are very, very different. We're dealing with different type of topology. We're dealing with calculation, cold, calculated, methodical planning. These are things that have always really interested me in the underlying motivations of why these individuals commit the offenses that they do. But when I was involved in the PhD program, Parkland occurred. Right, so that was when Nicholas Cruz attacked the South Florida school, Parkland. And in response to that, immediate response, the Florida legislature passed the red flag law, which ultimately became the subject of my study. So it just happened that multiple acts occurred sort of back to back. Pulse wasn't too far behind that, where we had multiple instances of very extreme cases of mass homicide in my state, right? In a state that I live and work in, and we had a political response to it. So I was interested in evaluating our response to it and evaluating underlying topology of mass homicide offenders. So that's what brought me to that specific issue.
Yeah. And interestingly, and maybe we'll have some time at the end to talk about this, but interestingly, now we're involved. So now you went from student. Well, you went from defense attorney, which you still are. You will be, of course. You're an attorney forever. It's like a minister forever kind of thing.
Until I tear up my bar card, it's going to happen eventually. It will. It will happen eventually. I just don't know
why.
when.
Why would you do that? You're not going to do that. You don't want to do that. You're not going to let that go. It's too hard to get, So once you get it, you keep it, right?
It's true. It's true. I'm never going to get out of it.
It's like a commercial's driver's license. You're not going to let it go. But anyway, so you went from successful defense attorney to PhD student to now faculty member, academic. You've joined the ranks of academia, and you're involved with me in the Parkland study, which is a qualitative study that's investigating sort of the deleterious outcomes, 5 years later, and life changes, if any, lived experiences, perceptions of. And we were able to complete the data collection, and we're in the analysis phase now. And it's really exciting and it's interesting. So here's what I want to do now. I want to just kind of like shift it right to you. I also made you co-host in case there was anything that you wanted to share your screen or any kind of like visuals if you had any. And like, let's get right into your study and your findings.
Sure. Okay. So again, what happened right after Parkland? And I mean, immediately after, days after, the Florida legislature enacted what is known as the red flag law or risk protection law. And what that is, 19 states have one. And the trend is, nationwide trend is, let's create more of these, right? So every single time an attack unfortunately happens, you'll see outlets like NPR, like CNN, like Fox talking about red flag laws and why all states don't have red flag laws. Well, what are they? So what this is, it operates kind of like an injunction where someone has not committed a crime, right? But someone around that person, it could be family, it could be a teacher, it could be a member of the community, it could be law enforcement, believes that that person presents a risk to another person because of their possession of a firearm, right? So this person is acting in a particular way that makes someone believe that it is dangerous to allow them to possess a firearm. So if these facts exist, law enforcement will create an affidavit, right? Just signed document along with a number of checklist items, right? To identify which factors are present. with the objective of having a judge remove those or that person's firearms and prohibit the person from possessing a firearm for a year. The reason this kind of prompted a lot of attention after Parkland, if a lot of you may remember, Nicholas Cruz, the individual who committed the act, Nicholas Cruz made a large number of threats ahead of time, meaning everyone kind of knew who he was, and he didn't make his plans secret, right? He vocalized his plans. Well, shockingly, about 70% of public mass homicide offenders do the exact same thing. So the idea is, if we know who these people are, then perhaps we can take their firearms away before they do what they're about to do. So it's a mitigation effort, right? So when I look at this, I'm thinking, okay, well, that sounds really nice, right? I mean, if we can just take somebody's guns and stop these things from happening, well, that's a beautiful scenario. But I don't think it's as easy as that, right? So my study, I was specifically looking at two different things. Number one, I wanted to know whether we could compare rates of homicide, and I'll tell you why I did homicide and not mass homicide in a minute, but rates of homicide before the implementation of the legislation versus after, right? So in other words, take public data, quantitative data, say, all right, what were homicide rates before this law ever came to be? And what are homicide rates now? Can we compare them? But in a perfect world, I'd love to look at mass homicide. Mass homicide is 4 or more killings in one instance, right? 4 or more. Serial would be separate acts of killing. Typically, we look at more than 2. Mass is all at once, 4 or more, okay? So I'd like to compare those rates, right? Because that's what these laws were designed to prevent, is mass homicide. That's why they were put on the board. We're saying that it's a mitigation effort, but unfortunately, we have absolutely no credible database for mass homicide prevalence, the incident rates. The CDC is working on it, but they haven't yet finished it. So the only data that we really have for mass homicide is media. And you can imagine the credibility factor for media is not quite there, right? And how they often define, meaning media reports, how they often define mass homicide, it's entirely sensationalized, and it's not valid from an actual perspective, right? Meaning you'll often see reports that say, well, prevalence of mass homicide is going through the roof. No, it actually really isn't. So the media cannot be trusted from an empirical perspective. So the ability to test rates of mass homicide before and after, almost impossible to do on any scientific level. So I had to compare actual homicide rates in the state of Florida. That's what I was looking at. The second, and I think more important angle of the study was to evaluate the risk protection petitions that were filed to determine whether these petitions are accurately targeting individuals who possess what we believe to be known characteristics of possible mass homicide offenders. So in other words, are we accurately and effectively identifying people from a threat perspective, right, within these petitions? Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm saying yes, and I'm on mute. So there you go.
All right. Okay, so starting at the very beginning, right? So when we look at the rates of homicide before and after, right, that was a basic statistical analysis, right? You take the numbers before, you do what's called an interrupted time series analysis in statistics, and you compare rates after, right? And what I found wasn't promising, right? So what I found was that homicide rates actually went up, right? So homicide rates increased in the state of Florida after implementation of the red flag law. Now, I did not draw any conclusions with this. I knew that I couldn't there's a large number of confounding variables, meaning variables that are outside of my control, outside the control of the study, that would have impacted those findings. So I knew that it was limited. In fact, Florida's rates of homicide mimicked national rates of homicide during the exact same time frame. The entire nation saw a pretty dramatic increase in rates of homicide during the same time period. So I did not draw a conclusion that would suggest somehow that the risk protection implementation impacted an increase in homicide. I didn't do that, but it's
I'm just going to interrupt you 1 second and ask you, was there anything peculiar about that time frame nationally?
Yes, COVID. Yes, we were involved in the COVID pandemic. This was during the shutdown, right? Where every single community across the United States was shut down. And we are, at least now, these are very, very early studies coming out, but we are starting to draw a correlation between an increase in crime during the COVID pandemic phase. So it is absolutely possible that the COVID pandemic could be one of the reasons why the increase went up. Another factor that's also directly related to COVID is that during COVID, what we know happened is an increase in firearm possession. There was a massive influx of people buying guns. And logically, what we know, and there's a lot of research to say this, is the more guns that are out there, the more firearm related homicides you tend to have. That's, it's a numbers game, right? The more people that have guns, the more likely you're going to have people doing not so great things with firearms, right? So both of those things were happening. So you have the shutdown with all of the factors that go with that, and then you have an influx of firearms that were not previously present. So we know that those are examples of confounding variables, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That were going on at that time. And honestly, with homicide in particular, there are so many variables that it's incredibly difficult to suggest a correlation between any type of policy and homicide rates. It's very hard to do that.
I just want to interrupt you 1 second, highlight and underscore for those who are PhD students, those who are interested in research, that this is what researchers talk about in terms of threats to validity in a study, and it has to do with history. So like what's happening historically during this time that I'm doing my study has nothing to do with my variables, has nothing to do with what it is that I'm actually examining, but there's something else that's going on, and it's a definite threat to validity. The other thing I want to just underscore is it's really interesting that you're absolutely right. Firearm sales went through the roof. Ammunition was very difficult. You couldn't get ammunition. First of all, there was like this shortage of ammo, and ammo was being sold for like $1 a bullet or something like that, something ridiculous, which it should only be like 11 cents or something crazy. And it really speaks to folks' fear. So when people are in fear or thinking that there's some kind of conspiracy or they're threatened in any way, they're going to go right to, their Second Amendment right, which is to purchase firearms. I just wanted to underscore that.
It's true. And, fear is a big factor, because not only can fear prompt the, purchase of firearms, which it definitely did, fear also promotes legislation. And that's what happened with the risk protection law. It's the fear that this could happen to your children, right? That an attack like this could happen at your school, at your shopping mall, at your concert. So we need to do something about it. That's rational. That makes sense. As a parent, that is rational, right? You want to do something to stop it. But the question is it effective? Right? That's the question. Are we doing what we should be doing with it? And I knew ahead of time that I would not have enough evidence. I would not have enough variables to link the implementation of red flag law to the rates of homicide. I knew that, but I still wanted it as a baseline. I think it's important to include simply as a point of discussion so that we understand the dynamic that we're working within. But as I indicated, to me, the more important element of the study was to look at the petitions. Florida in particular, I told you 19 states have these type of laws. Florida has issued in the first year alone more than 3,000 risk protection petitions. Other states like Connecticut, Washington, California, they literally issued less than 300 within a year. So Florida had a large volume. And again, this is right after Parkland. So emotions are really high, right? The political sentiment's really, really high. So what I wanted to do is look at these petitions, and they're in checklist format. Okay, so it's a petition that is created by the state legislature. And what it does is identify 15 different variables, 15, right? Ranging from whether the person displayed a weapon, to whether there's mental illness, to whether there's drug use, these type of things. 15 items on a checklist that the officer simply signs off on. That's it, just checks a box, okay? I wanted to look at the petitions in various counties. I selected the 3 most densely populated counties and the 3 least densely populated counties so that I could try to generalize, try to get as much demographic information that I could from the 3,000 plus petitions, which was literally impossible for me to evaluate, right? Because what I had to do is I had to go into the clerk system and I had to pool all of these documents, right? The petitions, the affidavits, the witness statements, the police reports, the court orders for these petitions. I couldn't do it for all 3,000. So I isolated it to the 6 counties. The 3 least dense counties had 0, no risk protection petitions at all. The 3 most densely populated, which is Broward, Pinellas, and Seminole, we had 556. So I evaluated 556 petitions. That is more than double what any other study had done up till that point, right, in any state. And Florida, no one had studied Florida at the time that I did the dissertation work. So what I wanted to do is to look at the petitions, look at the checklist, look at the factors or the variables that law enforcement and the judges were using to identify these individuals as posing a threat. That was the first thing I wanted to do. Why? Because although the FBI refuses to acknowledge a typology of mass homicide offenders, literature supports the fact that we actually have a wide number of factors that are pretty consistent with public mass homicide. And I differentiate public because public mass homicide is that which is Nicholas Cruz. That's your Pulse nightclub. That's Sandy Hook. That's Uvalde. That's the cases that get sensationalized by the media. Those are the cases that prompt political action, public outrage, those types of things. But the most common type of mass homicide is in the family. The most common, the most prevalent is your domestic attack, where someone may kill everyone in their family and then themselves. We are dealing with 2 different typologies. We're dealing with 2 different types of offenders. But the red flag laws are generated, right, created because of the mass attacks. So I wanted to look at the typology of those offenders, okay? And what we know is several things. And by the way, this isn't new. We have known this since the early 1990s when Columbine happened. So this is not something that is new to researchers, which is somewhat frustrating, I think, from my perspective. But we've known several things. And the most important, from my perspective, what I learned, is that about 70% of public mass homicide offenders will make their threats known ahead of time. So in other words, they announce it. They announce it to their friends. They announce it to their families. They announce it on social media. They announce it to teachers, to counselors. And historically, what seems to have happened is that people don't take them seriously, right? Meaning they'll hear the threat, but they don't think anything of it until after the fact. And they're like, oh yeah, well, come to think of it, they made this statement multiple times, right? So what we know is that they're not keeping these things secret. They are vocalizing their intent. Now, from a risk perspective, right, from an analysis perspective, if we know this about them, any type of mitigation effort should be to identify these people as a possible offender, right? So that we can then develop threat assessments around them. And this is exactly what was presented to Congress immediately after Columbine. So now we're dealing more than 20 years ago, right? So in other words, we know who these people are. Let's develop threat assessments. Well, that hasn't happened. So I'm thinking, well, perhaps these red flag petitions are that. Perhaps these red flag petitions can be used as a point of identifying possible offenders. So what do we look at? We look at whether the individual made a prior threat, right, of public mass homicide, right? What are some other things? What we know is that many of these offenders are literally bogged down with feelings of revenge, right? Meaning these people feel like they have been wronged, either by an individual, by a community, by a large set of people. It doesn't really matter what it is. It doesn't even matter if the underlying act actually occurred. In other words, whatever the perpetrator is upset about doesn't even matter if it happened. It's their perception that it happened. And they tend to vocalize their feelings of animosity toward other people. And they tend to believe that these external forces are the cause of whatever is going wrong in their lives. So they develop theories of revenge and plans of revenge. So we've got statements of mass attack, evidence of revenge. They also are methodical, right? And this was my concern with taking away a gun, because these are not impulse killings. These are not rage killings. These are not, I pick up a gun and decide to kill. These are carefully and methodically planned. The Columbine attackers planned it for more than a year, and they planned it on a specific day, which was Hitler's birthday. So the concern, of course, was, well, you can take away the gun. They're just going to plan around it, right? Because this is an impulse. So most of them have very significant evidence of planning, right? Evidence of planning an attack, right? So you've got revenge, you've got planning, you've got statements of mass attack. And then the other factor that we often see is a precipitating event. So it could be a loss of a job. It could be getting kicked out of school. It could be having problems in school, which, by the way, Nicholas Cruz had, right? So he had problems at school. He had revenge issues because he had social issues related to bullying. And he made multiple statements of mass attacks. So he kind of fits the bill on each one of these variables that we look at. So knowing that, right, knowing these variables that tend to be present in mass homicide offenders, I looked at the checklists and I started taking data on them and identifying what factors are actually being asked, right? And what's the prevalence of each factor. And you know what's not on the checklist? Any of those things, any of them. Not even whether an offender made a statement of intent to commit mass homicide. It's not in the checklist, none of them. So yeah.
Yeah, no. So I just want to ask you, so who put this together? And did they do any research, or was it this knee-jerk reaction legislation?
Well, it happened within days of Parkland. So yeah, it's definitely knee-jerk. And what I've also found is that most of the states, most of the 19, they're carbon copy of each other. So there's not, and there wouldn't be a whole lot of effort that goes into it because it's a legislative action that took days. Imagine our legislature getting something to a governor and getting signed within days. Right. Not a lot went into that. It's carbon copy, right? You take one version and you just copy it and say, see what I did? I did something good going to prevent mass homicide. To me, not only is that offensive, it's dangerous. Because what we're saying is that we've created this legislation designed to reduce mass homicide attacks. And yeah, you're taking a bunch of guns away. But are you, in fact, identifying possible offenders? Because the Secret Service has been telling us that that's step one for more than 20 years. And these petitions give us a way to do that, right? So, and there were many. So what I had to do when I'm digging through all of these petitions, I wanted to test for those variables. I wanted to see whether I could find those variables that are associated with mass homicide. And of course, I'm limited because I'm limited to whatever law enforcement chose to put in the writings, right? So if they elected to put information in, great. If they didn't, well, they didn't. But I did find 76 instances of individuals who made threats of mass attack, 76. Now, whether those are possible offenders or whether they're just banter, I don't know. But nothing happened as a result of that, right? So we take away the gun. So an order gets put in place, but there's no threat assessment. There's no information sharing. There's no wraparound services to address whatever the underlying problem is. We're literally just removing a firearm for a period of time. That's it. So you have these petitions that could be used to identify variables that we know are associated with mass attacks, that could be used to develop proper threat assessments, that could be used for information sharing amongst agencies. But right now, they're not. And you ask why I wanted to do the PhD. It's for reasons like this. Because the objective is to hopefully inform those who are making these decisions to make these things better and make them effective, right? Where it's not just about removing a gun, but it's about tailoring the mitigation effort to that which the Secret Service has been telling us for more than 20 years. I mean, the handwriting is on the wall. And it's incredibly, as a parent sending children to school, it is incredibly frustrating that we have this thing that I will tell you, even on a more frustrating level, my peers who are writing about the risk protection, they are gloating about them. All of the current literature that is out there is saying these are really promising, that they're able to identify individuals who are making threats. Yes, for researchers who are literally combing through affidavits, you can find them. But whether law enforcement is able to identify, whether community officials, whether schools, whether doctors, whether employers are able to use this information from a mitigation effort, that the unequivocal answer is no, no.
So that's what we need to hear from you when you write that journal article and publish that. And also whatever it is you're learning and we're learning from the Parkland study that we're doing, that we're involved in examining, because we're learning a lot of stuff from these survivors about what was known, what was already known, like that it was not a surprise, Nicholas Cruz and the things that he was doing, all of the indicators, all of those, the variables that you're discussing.
Right. It's rarely a surprise, but of course, after the fact, right? So after the fact, everyone comes up front and says, oh, I heard this and they did this and that and whatever. They were always demonstrating all kinds of concerning behaviors. And while it makes sense, it certainly makes sense that you might minimize that. If you hear a peer making a statement, you don't want to believe, of course, that this person could commit such an atrocity. So you may very well minimize it. But the truth is, this is a primary factor that is present in these type of offenders. So even if this person didn't mean the threat to be taken seriously, right? Even if that wasn't the case, the truth is we probably do need to be treating that in a threat assessment situation. So whether it's in a university, a high school, an employment situation, we do need to incorporate an education component so that students, so that professors, faculty, staff are aware of these variables so that they can take action. Because the idea is not to punish these people. They haven't committed a crime. So the idea is not to punish. The idea is to identify them, figure out what the underlying issue is. Because by the way, what it's not, at least what we don't think it is mental illness. Because there's not a huge correlation between mass homicide and mental illness. Now, that could be for a number of reasons. Remember, we have to be critical about existing literature. Existing literature says no correlation, but here's the flaw in that argument. Number one, mass homicide offenders, there's not a lot of them. So from a statistical perspective, we're looking at a very small number of people. Number two, mental illness is incredibly underreported. And most mass homicide offenders commit suicide either directly or by a cop, right? Meaning they're killed during the incident. So if they never received mental health services and they are deceased, we cannot conduct a mental health evaluation on that person. So is it possible that they are mentally ill and we just don't know it? Absolutely. And we have to acknowledge that. So existing literature says no direct correlation. What we do think is that there's a similar correlation with serial homicide, and that is cluster B personality traits. So think like your narcissistic personality, where you're focusing very much on you, and external is to blame for all of your problems, right? That's a very classic typology that we have. But whether there's underlying mental health issues, we don't know right now. The answer is no.
Right. I want you to know, I think I've said this before, but I want to say it publicly, that we're doing active shooter training, and we've been doing it now. I think we've trained over, I want to say 1,000 faculty and staff at NSU. And your dissertation and your literature informed that training, especially my part. So I wanted you to know that it's not, gone into a black hole. It's being used. And when we talk about at the PhD level, so as investigators, we examine these variables, and we want to know, like, we're very interested in our research questions, and then we have our findings, and it's all great. But then there's that, so what? Which I always say, like, so what? So how does this inform policy and practice? So how do you think your findings can inform policy and practice, and especially, as you said, law enforcement?
Well, I mean, obviously the first step is to get published, and I'm dealing with the peer review process now. So getting published definitely pushes it out there, and then entering dialogue. And fortunately, at least in the state of Florida, we have a number of very, very large police agencies that I'm certain would be more than happy to sit down and have this type of dialogue, because the consensus is very clear, right? We're fighting something that everyone agrees on, and that is we need to do something. And if we already have something available to us, let's make it more effective. And some of the changes that I'm recommending are really very minor. They are from adding a few checklist items to the face of the affidavits, to creating a centralized database, to information sharing. There was a student, for instance, in Seminole County, a child, that I looked at all of the petition, the supporting affidavits. The students' diaries, which were admitted into the docket, looked almost identical to the Michigan shooter's diaries, right? So,
Wow.
meaning her very descriptive description of what she wanted to do, both in words and art, down to the type of people, down to the number of people, down to how she would do it. Obviously, a risk protection order was put in place, but you know what else was put in place? Nothing, right? Meaning there's DCF is not involved. The school is not involved. Other police agencies are not involved. So once the year is up, the state can ask for an extension, but that's it, right? And I think hopefully, once I can get published, and once the research is out there, because it does stand in contrast to the existing literature, it's more, there's more to it. Right? I'm involving far more variables, and I'm also involving a legal component that the current peer research does not. And that's because I'm a lawyer. So I can, of course, interpret statutes. I will tell you, one of my peers actually had questions for me about the statute, and he tried to argue that a statute meant something that it didn't. I thought that was curious, but nevertheless, he's not a lawyer. So, we've got this sort of confrontation between academics and law. So it is complicated. This process is complicated, but getting published and getting out there and having law enforcement officials hear of the research, I think is the first step. And I'm hopeful that this can begin some really promising dialogue.
Wonderful. And I want to encourage you to start presenting this. Publication is one thing, and that's very important, but also to present at conferences, IACP, the Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences, etc. Actually, I think you still might be able to do that one for March 2024 in Chicago. So let's see what happens, but I want to encourage you to do that. I'm going to take some questions now. Is that all right? Okay. So we've got Jillian Snyder, who's actually participating in the webinar, and I am going to give her, I'm going to answer, I'm going to let her have mic privileges. So, Jillian, you can ask your question directly to Dr. Elvington because you're live now.
Can you hear me okay? I'm sorry, I'm in an airport.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you so much for letting me speak, Dr. Elvington, Dr. Telesco. So I actually work primarily with Congress and state legislators. That's what I do for a living, trying to educate them, advocate for certain public policy reforms, primarily based on academic research, which is evidence-based. But that's not the language that those individuals speak. So is there a way other than producing peer-reviewed journal articles that you think you could convey your findings in a way that's more digestible to the policymakers who will ultimately either introduce the bill that you're looking to pass or vote yay or nay on it?
Yes, and that's because my background's not academic. My background's not statistics. I'm a lawyer. I speak to these people, right? Simply suggesting to them that they're doing something that they're putting money into, that they're devoting resources to, because each agency is, right? So Pinellas County by itself, which is one of the densest populated counties, has an entire department just for these petitions, right? So there's a lot of resources being spent on these things. And no one wants to do something that doesn't actually have a positive effect, right? So if we can suggest doing something that's already on the books, but just making it better, and making it better by not putting a lot of effort into it, right? Because that's a key thing for policymakers, right? If it involves money, and if it involves time, if it involves complicated structures, we don't want to hear it, right? No, the question is, what is on the books? Does it identify who we need it to identify? Are there any mitigation strategies in place right now that will make it effective? And the answer is no. Can we do so easily? Can we implement these changes easily? The answer is yes, right? So yes, can I talk to these people? Yes, of course, right? Because I agree, they do not want academic lingo. And fortunately, academic lingo is not my native language. Right. So, yeah, I've spent my entire career talking to these people, meaning the stakeholders. So you're right. It needs to be sort of brought down into layman's terms. And ironically, though, one of the biggest issues that we have is information sharing. And I'm sure Dr. Telesco can join in on this from the law enforcement perspective, but that has consistently been a struggle. To get law enforcement agencies on board with significant information sharing has been a challenge throughout the criminal justice system, and is a challenge in every single jurisdiction, both state and federal. That I think is going to be the biggest hurdle, is to get people on board. They may agree in theory that it works or that it's needed, but getting them to do it is a totally different animal.
Yeah. I mean, I think the same thing is true of use of force data, not centralized. There is no standard database for that information. So, yeah, I mean, I think that these are the challenges, but then we have to be creative in various ways, whether it be, going before Congress or speaking at professional conferences, writing this for professional magazines, periodicals, journals, academic journals, whatever it is. But you bring a really nice kind of balance between the legal and the academic. And so that's what makes you so special and unique. And this information so fascinating and important, life-saving. It can be, if it's used correctly, right? And if people care enough. But sometimes we live in a reductionistic society, my opinion right now, that we want everything down to like this simple little bumper sticker that, it's just like, okay, the elevator speech. No, it's much more complicated than that. And it takes some research, and it takes some teasing out the data, and that takes time, and people don't want that. People are not interested in that. They want a simple answer, and there aren't simple answers.
Well, and that's what this was. It was a carbon copy legislation that fed into mass fear, right? That happened at that time. And it was also something that a lot of people could get on board with, including those that were not proponents of gun control, right? Because any time that you talk about any restriction in the Second Amendment, it gets people very, very upset. But taking guns away temporarily from people who are a danger to themselves or others is something that most people can get in line with. I can tell you most of the factual scenarios I evaluated, those people did not need to be possessing a firearm in the moment. Now, were they a threat to commit a mass homicide? Probably not, right? So from a policy perspective, is it a good idea to take their firearms? Probably, but is it an effective mitigation tool against mass homicide? In my opinion, not in its current state.
I think the other really interesting thing about Florida, hey, I mean, I'm here 20 years now. This is my home, even though, you can't take the New Yorker out of me really. But at the end of the day, I've been here 20 years. And what's really interesting to me about Florida is that in one breath, they do this, this red flag law. And then in the next breath, it's like, well, but everybody can carry at any time. When we don't need any concealed weapon permit, we don't need training, you don't need any of that, forget it. So it's just odd, right?
A little. I mean, that's a political shift, right? That particular legislation was prompted by Governor DeSantis. Governor DeSantis was not a fan of the red flag legislation. He was pretty vocally adamant against it. He obviously was not the governor that signed it into law. So there is some political differentiation there. And I think that often happens in Florida because Florida kind of swings back and forth. So you might see that within our state.
Good point. That's another confounding variable is the politics of the day. Right. Yes. Exactly. All right. Well, I'm going to call Layla on, one of our project managers. She's part of our production team. And hey, Layla. Layla is a criminal justice major. Not only is she that, but she's also the vice president of our Omega Tau chapter of Alpha Phi Sigma, which she is instrumental, her and Nicole Crimmy, who is the president now of the chapter. They are moving and shaking, and they are just taking those applications. And our chapter, which was sort of an inactive chapter in name only, is now a real chapter, vibrant and with meetings and meeting attendance. And they had a social tonight. So I just want to say shout out to Layla Horton, vice president of Omega Tau, the Alpha Phi Sigma chapter here at NSU, and also her president, the president, Nicole Crimmy, for all the work that they're doing with Alpha Phi Sigma. So thank you for that. And I know that you've got a couple of questions. The chat is blowing up with questions.
Yes.
And so can you navigate that for us?
Yes, I will. One of the first questions we have, Dr. Elvington, is from Angela. She asks, I think she meant how. How does the variance among red flag laws from one jurisdiction to another impact its overall effectiveness?
How do the variances, so the difference between them?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, so for the most part, most of the red flag laws are very, very similar. There's some differences. For instance, some jurisdictions, I had indicated in Florida, law enforcement has to initiate the process here in Florida. They're the ones that file the affidavits with the court. They're the ones that are vested with the sole responsibility of moving forward. Some jurisdictions will allow anyone to file a petition. So any member of the family, any member of the community can do so. There's no literature yet that would suggest, and remember, these are very new. So when you have a new type of legislation, the studies that are going on are ongoing now. So it takes time to get the literature out. So there's no literature out there that I'm aware of that would compare the types of red flag laws as to their efficacy. But like I said, one of the problems that we have in other jurisdictions, because what I'd like to do is compare Florida to the other jurisdictions, right? Meaning look at their petitions and see whether the same variables that I found in Florida are present in those jurisdictions that use very similar petitions, for instance, right? Like a carbon copy petition. One of the problems we have is those jurisdictions have very small numbers, right? Even states like California, we're talking about hundreds versus literally more than 3,000. So when you have a smaller pool to deal with, a sample to deal with, that is going to necessarily have an impact on the study, because the smaller numbers you have, the less you're able to generalize something, right? Meaning to apply it to a broader audience. If you only have 50, right? Well, that's a really small number to look at versus 3,000, right? So ultimately, I would like to conduct a study comparing them, but it hasn't been done. And like I said, there's variables there that could impact it. And I will say the jurisdictions that allow individual family members to file affidavits, that poses a large number of problems. Because at least if law enforcement is doing so, there's protocols, there's policies, there's law, right? Right, that's in place as to when the petitions are filed, whether the petitions are filed according to legal standard, right? Whether the legal definitions are being satisfied versus a member of the community. So I think when you broaden that to allow any individual to submit the affidavits, that in and of itself could necessarily impact the ultimate findings, if that makes sense.
Great. I know you got another question. What I did is I asked both Layla and Justin will be coming on after Layla, to sort of field, if they can, 3 to 4 of the best questions. I mean, they're all good questions, but we're not going to have time. Like I said, the chat is just blowing up, Dr. Elvington. But we're going to try to pick and select, some really juicy questions for you. Go ahead, Layla. Let's ask the second question.
Okay. Another one is from Shauna. Her question, or his question, was, with risk protection, does it start in grade school? Like risk assessment? Does risk assessment start in grade school?
It can. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
In fact, there are instances, I don't think I have anyone in elementary school. I think the youngest that I had was 12. So that's right on the cusp, right? That would typically be, I don't know what grade they were in, but probably 6th grade, somewhere around there. So yeah, it absolutely can. And I know some Florida schools are doing threat assessments, even for very young children. That's not the same thing as a risk protection, because risk protection is only if the person possesses a risk by virtue of a firearm, right? But like I said, the youngest that I had in my study was 12. So yeah, definitely young children. Yes.
Great. Maybe one more. We have one more, 2 more.
Yes, I have one more. Another one was by Ted. They asked, what's the percentage of threats that never come to fruition?
The percentage of threats that never come to fruition. Well, I mean, I don't think we would know the answer to that, right? And that's part of the problem in evaluating the efficacy of these things from evaluating homicide rates, because we really don't know whether the individuals making a threat would have done anything about it to begin with. I can tell you, I found 76, right? 76 instances out of the 556 that I evaluated, right? Where there were threats made, express threats to kill 4 or more people, because that's the standard, 4 or more people, right? But a lot of them, when I looked at the facts themselves, a lot of them in Broward in particular, so Fort Lauderdale, a lot of them immediately followed Nicholas Cruz. And it almost seemed like it was an attention type behavior. In other words, that the evidence itself may not support a criminal charge against that individual, but they still made the threat. So it's still qualified for a risk protection. So I think it's nearly impossible to say what would have happened. And that's why it's so difficult to evaluate it from that efficacy type standpoint. Because we will never know whether a direct threat was averted or not. All we can know is whether we're identifying the right people to develop threat assessments. That's really the only thing that we can analyze.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Layla. And I'm going to ask now for Justin to please come on and field the next 3, if we can select 3. I know it's hard because they're all really good questions. Go ahead, Justin.
Hi, Dr. Brooke Elvington. Nice to see you again. So there's a lot of questions in the chat. but one that was actually brought up a couple of times were by Kayla and Mike, and it was, so what about social bonds or lack of social bonds by shooters? Like, is this pointed out in the red flags, or like, do they look for this often?
No. Is it looked for within the petition itself? Is that what they're asking?
Yeah, that's kind of what I would assume, because they're talking about like the social bonds. I would say like in the schools that they go to, do they like look at that?
No, no, they don't. No. So in other words, whether the person is subjected to bullying, whether they have certain social problems or concerns, that is absolutely a factor related to known mass homicide typology or characteristics. And that is not a variable that is included on the petitions. It is not even discussed really in the affidavits or in the police reports, unless law enforcement simply elected to do so. I can tell you that I do not recall a single instance of law enforcement highlighting this fact. Should it be? That's a different dialogue, right? Because often, remember I suggested revenge. That was one of the primary characteristics we look at. Many instances that ultimately result in the revenge relate to the offender's perception of what is happening to them from a social perspective, whether that's bullying or what have you. So those two things are correlated, and no, it is not being identified on the petitions.
I'm going to interrupt a second, put my little researcher professor hat on for a minute. So how do you operationalize social bonds?
So in a study itself?
I mean, if it was going to be on the petition, if you were going to research it, how do you operationalize it? How do you break it down? How do you define it? How is it measured?
So it depends what they're asking. If what they're asking relates to the idea of being peer pressured, bullied, and having social concerns, if that's what we're talking about, then that's how you would have to identify it. Meaning you would have to say, is there evidence of suffering from bullying, for instance, right? You would have to specifically identify. I don't think you could ever use something as broad as societal bonds or social bonds, because that can mean a large number of things in a vast different scenarios. And law enforcement, who is responsible for doing this, they have to know what that means.
Exactly.
Right? Really do have to make it as simplistic as possible.
Right.
And that's why I say break it down into these checklists, right? Meaning, is there evidence of this? Fine, check it. If not, don't check it, right? Make it as basic as possible. So if the question relates to social pressures or bullying, that's how I would identify it, right? Meaning, is there evidence of bullying? If there is, that's certainly something that should be dealt with in a threat assessment and to wraparound services. I guess I should clarify, is that what the question is asking, or are they talking about social bonds in a more broad sense?
I guess it's hard to know, right, Justin, from the chat question. So we're just kind of having some fun with with what we think that individual means. But it also makes me think about the Parkland study and some of the preliminary findings in our study, where we heard two different things as it relates to social bonds. One is that Nicholas Cruz was bullied. In fact, one of the statements of our participants is that he was bullied and like tortured pretty much by his peers. So there's that. And then on the other hand, as it relates to the Parkland study preliminary findings, is that the peer group, the friend group of the survivors is what got them through. That they continually want, time and time again, no matter who we were asking and no matter what the question was, they were telling us that it was their friend group that helped them to somehow cope with this trauma. And it wasn't therapy, and it wasn't, law enforcement, it wasn't school administrators, and it wasn't even parents. It was the friend group. And so I think that speaks, both of those ends speak to social bonds. Okay, Justin, sorry, I just kind of hijacked that, but that's okay. So let's go to question 2.
Yeah, so another question was by Ashley, and she was saying if it would be more effective to have these evaluations done at the time of firearm purchases.
Well, I suppose I would say probably not. And here's why I say that. If everyone was subjected to these types of questions, the first natural question is who's going to be doing the evaluation, right? Meaning who's going to be asking these questions, who's going to be determining the prevalence of these factors, right? Are we dealing with the gun dealer? Are we dealing with some sort of centralized government agency? Are we dealing with law enforcement? Any of those variables would involve a mass quantity of resources that truthfully, I think would simply be impossible to do. In addition, some of the questions or some of the variables that are on there could violate the law, right? Meaning asking individuals about their mental health, their mental illness, their diagnoses. That violates a number of components that we have, right? And again, who's asking, right? So although in theory, it would be really nice to know who's buying a gun and whether they can safely secure a firearm and whether they're mentally stable to do so. In practice, no, I don't think that could happen. From both practical concerns as well as legal concerns.
Great. Final question, Justin, on your end?
Yeah, there's one more question, and it was saying how can red flags law find a balance between the issue of public safety and also possible legal concerns like due process?
Okay, so that's actually a really good question. Red flag laws have been challenged in the state of Florida. The courts have systematically upheld them as being constitutional. And one of the reasons why they are being upheld is because of the process that is afforded to the individuals with these red flags. So what happens when a petition is filed, the court can temporarily issue an order removing a person's firearms. However, that person is entitled to an evidentiary hearing. And at that hearing, it is the government's burden of proof to prove that removal of the firearm is necessary and that they have sufficient facts to check those boxes, so to speak, speaking in layman's terms, pursuant to the statutory requirements. And that order is subject to appellate review. So you are entitled to a full-blown evidentiary hearing in front of a judge, and it is the government's burden of proof to establish this. So you are, in fact, afforded due process rights throughout the entire proceeding. And keep in mind, while the Second Amendment is implicated, all rights can be restricted, even those that are fundamental. Your Second Amendment right is not deemed fundamental. It's actually in the intermediate stage of the Bill of Rights. The government absolutely has the ability and the constitutional ability to restrict your access to firearms. Of course, due process applies, and keep in mind, this is a limited restriction. This isn't a permanent restriction. It's a 12-month restriction that can only be extended if the state meets its burden, and it's a tight burden.
Right.
So there's definitely due process procedures in place.
Excellent. All right. Fendi, I'm going to give you talking privileges. She's participating in the webinar. And so that's the beauty of having the webinar live streamed on YouTube. If you're on YouTube and you're watching, you can join us in the chat, but you can't talk. But if you join us through the webinar link, then you can talk. So Fendi, Fendi is one of my undergrad students. You probably know her, Dr. Elvington, from our preliminary hearing. And she's in Intro to CJ. She's a CJ. I think she's a CJ major, right, Fendi? I just gave you talking rights.
Yeah, I'm a criminal justice minor and a psych major.
Awesome. What's your question, Fendi?
It's not really a question. It was just like a statement. I was just saying that unfortunately, medical costs would probably not allow for psych evaluations for everyone who tries to purchase a gun.
Oh, to purchase a firearm?
Yeah, or to or to
Right.
receive one in any form.
Well, and that would also directly implicate privacy rights. And at least in Florida, while the federal constitution does not have an enumerated right to privacy, the Florida Constitution does. And so that would necessarily implicate constitutional rights that I would argue could go beyond that which they would be able to do. Because ultimately the interest would not be narrow enough. In other words, that's a very, very broad approach if you're applying that to every single person. So yeah, expensive, time consuming, and also likely not lawful.
Great, thank you. You would have been really proud of Fendi today. She was running one of the she was doing a deposition on one of the witnesses for the prosecution today for the mock trial, and she did a great
Nice.
job. Yeah.
Yeah.
Love that.
And that's the other really wonderful thing about having you, Dr. Elvington, on our faculty is that you can mentor so many of our students who are interested in the law. And so they really look up to you as a role model. And I know that you rise to the occasion on that consistently.
Definitely try. I love dealing with them. I'm on ground now, obviously, as you know, and I'm dealing with a pretty big criminal law class, and it's super fun. You know, they're all coming to your trial. So I've incorporated that into the course. So they're going to be coming to the trial in November.
That is awesome. And they're going to be the jurors, right? Don't tell them anything about it, the case, because then,
Nope.
I have the prosecution down my throat saying how unfair it is protesting. But anyway,
It's my
that's
class.
wonderful.
Come on.
No. But they're going to be really well-informed jurors. That's for sure.
They
So,
really-
Any last thoughts? You get the last word, Dr. Elvington, and then we'll start doing some shameless plugs about what's coming up next with
Awesome.
investigation.
Well, obviously, I want to thank you for having me here and inviting me to talk about this that I've been dealing with now for several years, and something that's very, very close to me, to my heart. So I want to thank you for doing that. But ultimately, while my research is not in sync with a lot of the literature that is out there, I think my findings are important, and I'm hopeful that we can come to the table and start a policy discussion on making these things better, because that's something that I think we can all agree to. So thank you
Wonderful.
so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for being here with us, and we'll see you soon.
Of course.
Thank you. So, Justin, I'm going to ask you to come on, please. Justin and Layla, maybe you guys can give us a little shameless plug commercial about what's coming up next. What is on tap for investigation with Dr. T, if you don't mind. Justin, you want to start us off?
Yes, give me 1 second. I'm loading it up right now.
And we're also in the process, by the way, of getting our season ready for the spring, starting in January. We have a really amazing lineup with a lot of judges. We have some judges. We have some mental health judges, mental health court, drug court judges. We have a criminal defense attorney. We have a state's attorney that we're thinking about asking, and we have a forensics person. So we have a lot of really cool topics that are coming up, but we're still massaging that and getting that ready. We're developing it now. Go ahead, Justin. Tell us what's coming up.
Yeah, so for the start of November, on the 2nd, we have Human Trafficking Forum with our special guests Tracy Moore and Jose Ramirez, who are special agents.
And we also have isn't there a victim there? So that's a 3-panel. That should be a 3-panel, right?
And Savannah Purvu from Florida Alliance for Human Trafficking.
Yeah. So we have a victim, and then we have 2 special agents, and it's the Florida Alliance Against Human Trafficking. That's going to be really exciting. So that's our next show. Then the show after that is what? Layla, you want to give it to us?
Sure. That show's going to be November 9th, and that is the impact of COVID-19 on labor trafficking in the U.S. with Dr. Anthony Matolo.
And he happens to be a PhD student who graduated and successfully defended his dissertation. So it's another kind of alumni spotlight that we like to do. So it's kind of we serve 2 purposes there. And Justin, who's after that?
After that, on November 16th, we have A Day in the Life of a DEA Special Agent with special guest Dr. Sean Laurer, who is a supervisor special agent at the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration.
Excellent. That'll be exciting and interesting. And Layla, who's after that?
And then last but not least, on November 30th, we have Ed Denzel from Unfound.
Yay.
It's going to be talking about the Colonial Parkway disappearance.
Perfect. So I love my production team. They're amazing. And I thank you again, Dr. Elvington. We want to say a special thank you to Dr. Durham, who's been watching. She's been a great supporter. And in fact, as you heard in the beginning of Investigation with Dr. T, this is really her idea. The whole thing is her idea. And so we appreciate her support, Dr. Castro, Dr. Kushner, all of our faculty. And we'll see you next time. What's the date again? Next time? Is it next Thursday?
Yes, November 2nd.
All right. We'll see you next Thursday, everybody. Okay. Have a good night. Be safe.